Well, good evening, everybody, and let me welcome you to a terrific evening and a terrific program we're going to have tonight. First, Shana Tova, a sweet and healthy and happy New Year to everybody on this call. I'm Mark Blattner. I'm the President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, and we're really delighted to have you with us. Over the spring and summer, you'll probably recall that we held a series of weekly Wednesday conversations with a variety of speakers on multiple topics, and it was a huge success. But we decided as things began to open up more that doing a weekly program became too much. Thus, Thoughtful Thursdays were born. Once a month, we will bring a nationally recognized Jewish speaker to our community virtually. Tonight is the start of that program, and you are in for a real treat. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin is a rabbi, scholar, and best-selling author of 18 books, among them A Code of Jewish Ethics, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and my personal favorite, Rebbe, The Life and Teachings of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. His book, Jewish Literacy, is the widest-selling work on the topic of Judaism. Just think of all those bar and bat mitzvah kids who received that book. He lives with his wife, Devorah, in New York City and lectures regularly throughout the United States. Rabbi Telushkin will give his remarks, and if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll do questions afterwards. So, live from late night in New York, I'd like to welcome Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. Rabbi, welcome.
Hi, Mark, thank you so much. I've been very excited about this evening. I have a lot of affection for Portland. I have a lot of affection for you, Mark. And the topic is so pertinent now. The topic really is the subject of forgiveness. And what does Judaism say about forgiveness and how does it shape us? Years ago, when I was working on the first volume of my Code of Jewish Ethics, I was doing research the old-fashioned way, the way I've been doing it since I was pretty young. I was reading through, since I had been speaking on subjects of Jewish ethics for many years, I didn't want to just end up repeating things that I already said. So I decided I was going to investigate each topic that I covered in the book anew. And so I would sit down when I was working on forgiveness, start reading through everything in the Bible relevant to the subject of forgiveness. Then I'd look in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and medieval Jewish thinkers, modern Jewish thinkers, and modern non-Jewish thinkers. I wanted to get wisdom from wherever I could get it. I remember by the time I had probably about 150 note cards on the subject of forgiveness, I started really looking through them, and something struck me. Maybe others have written about it in the same way, but what was striking to me was that there seemed to be three fundamental attitudes on forgiveness. And what's good is it's going to make my talk quite easy to follow. The first is, when is forgiveness mandatory? Second is, when is forgiveness optional? And the third is, and this is an innovative feature of Judaism and certainly seems to distinguish us from contemporary Christianity, is when is forgiveness forbidden? Because Judaism does have some very serious teachings on that. Not everything can be forgiven. I think it'll make sense when I get to it. And then my sort of dessert and postscript after it is, we're talking about when we should grant forgiveness. But guess what? A lot of us also need to get forgiveness from others. So the second part of my talk is going to deal with the subject of apologies. How do you apologize? What are guidelines if the goal of your apology is to establish a peaceful relationship? So to start first with, when is forgiveness obligatory? The answer is, in the large majority of instances. If somebody has hurt you, but the hurt that they inflicted is not irrevocable, and they sincerely ask for forgiveness, you should forgive. They come to you, whatever they did. Now, what happens, though, if you're still pretty angry at them? Even if you recognize that they seem to feel pretty badly about it, what is it? What should you do? And there's an interesting option. You don't have to forgive the first time you're asked. It's considered meritorious to do so, but if it's clearly a bit of a phony forgiveness, you really have anger and you really feel you've been hurt, you don't have to forgive. Indeed, the person who hurt you is obligated to ask you up to 3 times. And they can't be one after the other. They can't say, do you forgive me? No. Do you forgive me? No. Do you forgive me? No. Obviously, you can't do that. Obviously, it has to be on 3 separate occasions. There's a story they tell about a rabbi in England, Eliyahu Lopian, where a man came and said, Rabbi, I sinned against you. Please forgive me. And the rabbi asked the man, well, what did you do? And the man was too embarrassed and didn't want to tell the rabbi. And the rabbi said, I can't just say I forgive you if I don't know what you did to me. It would be like somebody coming and saying, I stole some money from you, and not telling you how much they stole. Obviously, you're going to react very differently if it was $5 than if it was $50,000. So anyway, Lopian said, I can't forgive you unless you tell me what you did. So finally, the man confessed that he had spoken very ill of the rabbi, had done, damage to him. And the rabbi said, look, I could say I forgive you now, but it won't be sincere. Please come back in 2 weeks, and I'm going to work on myself. I now have a task. I have to study Musar. I have to study the Jewish moral works. I have to eliminate the anger I am feeling now in my heart. Because when somebody has hurt us, we do feel an anger. And it's often there's a sense of humiliation. It's very interesting. So what do we say sometimes when we've hurt somebody and we want forgiveness? I beg your forgiveness. The word beg is an inherently humiliating word. I think there are a few things that almost any of us could find more horrifying than if we were reduced to such a bad financial circumstance that we had to go out in the street and beg. And, and obviously the word beg is etymologically related to the word beggar. So if you have to say to somebody, I beg your forgiveness, that puts you in a certain humiliating circumstance. And I'm going to return to that theme when we're talking about apologizing. So somebody has hurt you, and you have to work on yourself to be able to forgive them. But you should never withhold forgiveness for more than 3 instances. Maimonides, Rambam, who's considered the exemplar, the rabbinic figure of unparalleled greatness and ruling, just as Rashi is Maimonides is the post-rabbinic figure, the medieval period. Rashi is the great exemplar of commentary on the Bible and on the Talmud. Maimonides was the codifier. He put down the laws. Maimonides says anybody who refuses more than 3 sincere requests for forgiveness is achzari, is acting like a cruel person. And so that's your obligation. If somebody has hurt you and the hurt is not an irrevocable one, you should forgive them. And that enables you to then resume a relationship. When, however, is forgiveness optional in Jewish law? In 2 instances. You are not obligated to forgive somebody who has done you irrevocable harm. A drunk driver who runs you over and leaves you with permanent conditions of pain, no matter how sincere the person is, you are not obligated to forgive them. You can choose to do so. And I want to speak in a couple of minutes about why sometimes it's wise to do so. And secondly, you're not obligated to forgive somebody if they don't ask for forgiveness. Nonetheless, I'm going to argue that in some cases, it's actually a very smart thing to forgive. And I'll tell you why. We often then go around carrying grudges. I remember years ago, I was speaking to a man who I consider one of the great figures of modern Jewish life, Abraham Twersky. Abraham Twersky, who's a psychiatrist and who's written many wonderful books, usually in one way or another related to the subject of self-esteem. I remember I once asked Twersky, and this was many years ago when he had written only 40 books. He's now written about 60. And he said to me, I've written 40 books, but they're all on the same subject of self-esteem. But anyway, Twersky comes from a great Hasidic dynasty. He himself is an ordained rabbi. He's a major scholar, a major Talmid Chacham. And Tversky, though, chose to become a doctor. And when he became a doctor, he chose to become a psychiatrist. And his specialty was dealing with addictive behavior. When he became a psychiatrist in the early 1960s, addictive behavior usually was the term used to refer to alcoholism, alcoholics. By the late 60s, it was also used to refer to drug addicts. And today, self-destructive behavior of all sorts, which refers to a whole area, to how many areas where we engage in self-destructive behavior and sometimes even addictive behavior. Anyway, Tversky was speaking to a recovering alcoholic. And obviously the big struggle for recovering alcoholics is how to resist that first drink. Because their very problem is that once they start drinking, they cannot limit themselves. So how do you resist the first drink? And one recovering alcoholic said something very insightful to Tversky. He said, when am I most apt to be really tempted to drink? When I'm in a conflict with somebody. The sort of conflict that you wake up in the middle of the night, you have to go to the bathroom, and then you can't fall back asleep because you keep thinking about how upset you are with this person, and all sorts of issues that are going on. And so this man then said something so wise to Tversky that it applies not only to recovering alcoholics, it applies, I suspect, to every one of you, including me, every one of us. He said, I learned that I had to overcome grudges because carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. Why would anybody want that? It's so smart, I'm going to repeat it. Carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. So even in instances where forgiveness is optional, there are times when it might be wise for one's own well-being to forgive someone. I remember there was somebody who once did something, I don't want to exactly say what it was, but did do something in that nature, very unforgivable to me and caused me tremendous damage. And later on, years later, he reached out to me when I saw him, and I said, I want you to know I forgive you. I forgive your behavior. But when he really wanted to resume friendship with me, he had done something that you really can't, I'll say what it was. It was somebody I had consulted in a therapeutic setting who I found out was gossiping about me, which is about one of the worst things you can imagine for a therapist to have done. Another person who gave me considerable insight on this issue of forgiving when it's optional is another friend. Rabbi Tversky is a friend, and another friend, Rabbi Harold Kushner. Kushner, of course, is most well known for his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. But the truth is, any of you who've read any of Harold's other books know that he has an immense store of wisdom. Anyway, Rabbi Kushner was for many years a pulpit rabbi. And during the years he was a pulpit rabbi, there was a woman in his congregation whose husband left her for a younger woman. He did it in an extremely mean-spirited way. And so he, first of all, so he did that. It reminds me of a joke, actually, of a woman who's being questioned whether she could be on a jury. And the judge starts asking her some questions, and the woman says, well, I can't be on a jury. I'm totally opposed. I'm totally opposed to capital punishment. No matter what the circumstances, I would never vote on that. And the judge said to her, well, this is not a case that involves capital punishment. It's a case of a man who deserted his wife, and just before he deserted his wife, he emptied out all of their bank accounts and then ran off with another woman. So the woman said, oh, that case I could be on, and I might even be wrong on capital punishment. But in any case, by the way, it's a little disconcerting when you give a speech and you don't actually have an audience in front of you because you have no idea how people are reacting. Usually for me, so when I do anything humorous, I can sort of pick up on it. But anyway, in Harold Kushner's case, there was a woman in his congregation. Her husband had left her. They got divorced. He was terrible about financial issues. They had 2 children. He paid almost no attention to the children. And I just realized I started telling, yes, okay, excuse me. I wish I could do a take 2. No, and he paid no attention to the children. And so Kushner said when he first met with this woman and he saw the depth of her anger, he utterly empathized with her. But 10 years later, when her anger was not one whit diminished, he said to her, "You've been carrying around a hot coal in your hand for 10 years to throw at your ex-husband, and all that you've ended up doing is burning a hole in your hand." So that's really the reason I believe why it's sometimes wise to forgive. By the way, I'll give you another case that Harold Kushner told me of a woman in his congregation whose father was about to die, who, for all I know, she might have been one of the 2 children in this other case, because he had been a miserable father who had left the mother, was very stingy, financially stingy in every possible way. And she asked Rabbi Kushner 2 questions. Should she go to the funeral? She didn't want to go. And secondly, should she say Kaddish? The memorial prayer for the dead. So what Kushner said, first of all, I think you should go to the funeral. I'll tell you one reason why. If you don't go and you regret not having gone, you'll regret it for years. If you do go and regret it, okay, so a day passes. As regards Kaddish, his suggestion to her was, I would try and say Kaddish for him at least a few times. And if you can't say it for him, say it for the father you never had. Because everybody is entitled to have a father and a mother who love them and who care for them. And if this man treated you so miserably, then say Kaddish for the father that you really didn't have. So these are 2 reasons why I think it's good to sometimes grant forgiveness. I don't know how many of you follow the old Jewish tradition that just before you go to sleep at night, you're supposed to say the Shema. I have found over the years that many Jews who do that literally just say those 6 words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But as you know, the Jewish prayer book is not a zero-sum game. It's not like they ever made a decision, well, if we're going to add on a prayer, we'll take out another prayer. So if you ever look, for example, in the Orthodox Art Scroll Siddur, there is prayers to be said before you go to sleep at night, and they're now 8 pages. The Kriyat Shema, the Shema that you say at that time. I always figure, even if you have trouble sleeping, by the time you finish all 8 pages, you'll probably be able to sleep. But one of the prayers begins, Hareini Mochel, I hereby forgive, in which you go to sleep after listing, I forgive anybody who did this to me, who did that to me, a whole host of things that you want to let go. And it's really not a bad idea before you go to sleep at night to try and release some of that anger. Certainly not to start rehashing and rehearsing. There are people I know who rehearse their anger and, they just go through it again and again. My wife, Devorah, though, makes a very important point. Let's say somebody has hurt you and hasn't asked for forgiveness, and you want to forgive them. I think you should, but I also think you should say something to them. My wife started doing it, and what ended up happening was she would mention to people something they had done that had hurt her. And very often people who've hurt us are not aware that they have hurt us. And in a number of instances, people actually cried. They were very unhappy that they had hurt her and had done it obliviously. And a lot of us do it. We do it in ways we say things that embarrass other people. There are a whole bunch of ways we can hurt other people. So this is really an important thing. There are times when forgiveness is optional, but there are good reasons to think about forgiving and to try and create circumstances where you could express even to the other person what happened, and certainly not to get consumed by it. Now, I mentioned at the very outset of my speech that there are times when Judaism holds forgiveness to be prohibited, and that is to forgive something from which somebody else suffered. Strangely enough, in Christianity, in contemporary Christianity, there often is the notion of forgiving people for bad things that they did, but they might have done these bad things actually to other people, and you don't really have the right to forgive it. I'll give you a couple of examples. And I'm going to read one. In August 1997, the Reverend John Miller of Martha's Vineyard. Now you're going to wonder, why am I picking on John Miller from Martha's Vineyard? He's not that famous a figure, but he had an experience that many clergy would be honored to have. He was visited by the Secret Service, who told him that that Sunday, President Clinton would be attending his service. So obviously, he was in the unusual situation that week of writing a sermon for the normal crowd, a couple of hundred people, let's say, who would normally come to a church service. But we can be pretty sure that this was going to be his one opportunity to speak before the President of the United States. The President was going to have to stay alert. It would be very embarrassing to the President if they found out, he had fallen asleep during the sermon. And so he had one chance to address Clinton, and what he chose to speak on was the subject of forgiveness. And he presented the following. In the middle of his speech, he held up a photo of Timothy McVeigh. You might remember who Timothy McVeigh was. He was the man who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. And I also learned a word from him. Oh God, what was the expression that he used? He killed 24 children. He used a term, like that was just, extra damage, but, he clearly didn't really feel that bad about it. And he held up this picture of Timothy McVeigh, and he says, I invite you to look at Timothy McVeigh and forgive him. I have forgiven him. I ask you to forgive him. We as Christians are asked to do so. I must admit, I don't even understand what that means. If the parents of the 24 children, what are they going to go to the parents of the 24 children and say, we're good Christians, we forgave Timothy McVeigh. If you haven't, you're not a good Christian. I don't even begin to understand what he meant, but that is indeed what he said. And I'll give you another example, but this involves a figure, I don't know anything about the Reverend John Miller, so he might well be a very wonderful person. So I'm not criticizing him personally, but I'm criticizing his understanding of forgiveness. But I'll give you another example. On September 11th, 2002, which means it was the first anniversary of 2001, I'm going to tell you in a minute what Pope John Paul II, the prayer that he offered, which I also find problematic. But before I tell you the prayer, I want to say something else. I loved Pope John Paul II. I actually had the honor of having a brief meeting with him, and I love him for several reasons. One is he recognized Israel, which the Vatican had long refused to do. Secondly, he went and prayed in Israel at the Kotel and even put a note into the wall. Third, he went and prayed at a synagogue in Rome. And the fourth reason is a very unusual one. There's a book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, written by the late Yaffa Eliach, who I knew from my childhood. Her husband was my principal at the Yeshiva of Flatbush in Brooklyn. And Yaffa Eliach was also a historian with a PhD in history. So when you hear a book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, you probably, think they're very beautiful stories, inspiring stories, but wouldn't necessarily be precise in the details. But she really went for precision. And she spoke to a man who had had the following remarkable experience. His parents and he were confined in the ghetto. I forget which city. She has it written in the book. And it was clear at that point, it was in Poland, it was clear at that point the Nazis were taking people away and they were never heard from again. The parents snuck out of the ghetto. They couldn't join the partisans because most of the partisans in Poland were anti-Semitic and didn't accept the Jews. They only had one goal in mind, to save their 2-year-old son. And there was a Polish couple who had been friends of theirs from before the war, and they went to their house and they asked the couple to take care of, if they were willing, and the couple were willing, to take their 2-year-old son. And they then said, after the war ends, please return him to us. But if we don't come back, and then they left the couple on a piece of paper the addresses of 2 families that were very closely related to them, one in Montreal and the other in Washington, D.C. And the couple took the child. The parents actually having nowhere else to go, I think went back to the ghetto. And this couple raised them. Now, this couple were risking their lives to raise this boy, and they had to leave the town in which they lived because everybody knew that this woman was, that this couple were childless, and suddenly they have a 2-year-old child. So they had to be on the move, and they were religious Catholics, so they raised the child as a Catholic. The war ends in May. The parents don't return. By early 1946, they went to their local parish priest, and they said, the parents clearly are dead. We want to adopt this child, and we want you to baptize him, and we'll raise him as our own. You know, by then you can imagine they were very close, and the boy was very close with them. The priest said to them, tell me exactly what the parents said to you when they entrusted this child to you. And they were honest people. They said they did give us the addresses of 2 families in North America. The priest, the parish priest, said to them, okay, write to those 2 families. If both of them do not adopt the child, you then will adopt the child. I will then perform the baptism, and that's what we'll do. They wrote, but both families in America wanted to adopt the child. The child first went to Montreal. The closer relationship was in Washington. And a year later, it was harder, immigration reasons, it was harder to get into Washington than Montreal. So a year later, the child went to live with the family in Washington. Needless to say, they always stayed in touch with this Polish family. And the Polish people were not affluent by any means. And they would send money to them, and they'd send pictures of the boy. It was a very nice relationship. Over the years, the husband died. And then suddenly, I think it was in 1978, they get a letter from this woman in which, for the first time, she tells them the story of how they went to their local parish priest and they wanted to convert him, and the whole thing that happened with the priest. She said, and why am I telling you this story now? Because yesterday that local parish priest became Pope John Paul II. It's one of the most astonishing and beautiful stories that I know. Now I feel free to say something a little critical about John Paul II, because I've established how high a regard I have for him. But we differ on the issue regarding forgiveness. So what was the prayer he offered on September 11th, 2002? We pray for the victims today. May they rest in peace, and may God show mercy and forgiveness for the authors of this terrible attack. First of all, why should they be forgiven? If they had any regret at all, it's because they crashed the plane into the tower at 8:45 in the morning. Had they known probably American work habits better, they probably would have done it at 10 in the morning. You know, why should they be forgiven for a crime they committed against, somebody else? There's a wonderful line in the Bible. In much of the world, families were allowed to forgive murder. It still exists in parts of the Arab world. They can ransom it. In Saudi Arabia, there was a case recently where a man was sentenced to death for murdering another man, and the family of the murderer was offering a lot of money to the other family to forgive him, and to sort of pardon it so that he wouldn't be executed, and they refused to do so, and the man was executed. But very often the case is the family would do it. Anyway, in the Torah, this was so common in the ancient world that the Torah actually says, "V'lo tikhu kofer lenefesh rotzeach." You may not accept ransom for the life of a murderer. The only one who can forgive an offense committed against themselves is the person himself. That's why there's a famous teaching in the Talmud as we prepare for Yom Kippur. There's a famous teaching in the Talmud that says Yom Kippur can atone for sins between people and God. But as regards sins between people and others, Yom Kippur cannot atone. You must go and seek forgiveness from those whom you hurt. What ends up happening as a result, which is fairly self-explanatory, is that murder becomes a crime that is inherently unforgivable. Now, what happens if the parents say that they are willing to forgive the murderer? And there are cases like that. The parents have the right to forgive the murderer for the pain that the parents, suffered. But the child was not a possession of theirs that they could forgive in the child's name. We don't know really what the child would have wanted. And so that becomes an unforgivable offense. And I remember reading once, something that Elie Wiesel wrote. It was like a plea to God, no matter what, do not, let me find this, right. On the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Elie Wiesel offered the following public statement. Although we know that God is merciful, please God, do not have mercy for those people who created this place. Remember the nocturnal procession of children, of more children, so frightened, so quiet. If we could simply look at one, our hearts would break, but it did not break the hearts of the murderers. And so we end up, therefore, with a situation where there are three attitudes on forgiveness in Judaism. One is times when it is obligatory. So think about it. If the damage and the hurt you suffered is not irrevocable, and somebody really sincerely requests forgiveness, you are obligated to do so. If you're angry, ask the person to come back, but work on yourself. And after three requests of the other person, you are designated by Maimonides as being an achzari, a cruel person. And it is considered a bit of a sin on your part. Secondly, instances when forgiveness is optional. When is it optional? When somebody doesn't ask for forgiveness, or somebody really did, God forbid, inflict an irrevocable hurt on you. I gave an example of a drunken driver. Or you can give an example of somebody who besmirched your good name. Because even though they're sorry, once your name has been damaged, it's very hard, to get your good name back. And yet, as I indicated, there are reasons why sometimes you should struggle with yourself, particularly if the other party really does seem to feel really truly contrite about it. But the instances of Harold Kushner, where he said to the woman, for 10 years, you've been carrying a burning coal in your hand, ready to throw it at your husband, and all you've done is burn a hole in your hand. And what Abraham Tversky said, carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. Why would anybody do that? And then third is the rare instances, when forgiveness is forbidden. It's something very, very extreme. But you can't forgive crimes committed against other people. And it's not only murder you can't forgive any crime committed against another person. What does it even mean to say I forgive in such a case? If somebody at this very moment, God forbid, is raping a woman, or somebody is sexually abusing a child, what does it mean to say I forgive people? So, those really summarize the three attitudes. I want to say something now about apologies, because there are things we also have to do, and we also have to apologize for. Let me tell you a story about an apology from my own life. It was a slightly embarrassing event, but it really was also, I understand in retrospect, actually a very funny event. There was a 2-year period in the 1990s when my wife and I and our children were living in Boulder, Colorado, and I was invited to give a speech at the JCC in Denver, which then was a little less than an hour's drive away. And 2 of my daughters, Naomi, who was then 6, and Shira, who was then 4, wanted to come to my speech. And I remember I didn't think it wise to bring them to my speech. They were young. It was going to be over their heads. And so I discouraged them. But they said, Daddy, we know you go around the country giving speeches, and we really want to hear one of your speeches. So I bring them to the speech in Denver. I'm a very proud father. I introduced them to the audience, and it was a big audience. It was maybe 300 people. And everybody applauds, and they sit down in the front row. About 10 minutes into the speech, I asked the audience, how many of you, excuse me, how many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house? In the front row, my daughter Naomi's hand goes up, and then Shira's hand goes up. You can imagine the laughter that ensued when the audience saw this, these 2 little kids. There were other people who would also raise their hands. It was very embarrassing for me. Finally, I came back with the only comeback line I could possibly say. I said, well, unfortunately, my wife has a bad temper. But the truth of the matter is, she had said it about me, and I'll tell you why she said it. Naomi was 6. She was in the 1st grade in an experimental school that somehow was being very lax about teaching the kids how to read, doing that. So I undertook to teach her how to read. And my wife says that whenever I explain something to somebody, the first time I am very patient. The second time, I'm also very patient. By the 3rd time, my wife says I could become a little snappy. So I had snapped at Naomi a number of times. So when the speech ended, I went over to Naomi and I said, first of all, Naomi, I want to apologize. I said, when you made mistakes, you weren't doing it to be bad. And for me to get angry at you was the wrong thing for me to do. And by the way, if it ever happens again and I get angry, you should say to me, Daddy, you're not supposed to do that. She actually did start saying that. And the funny thing was, it was very irritating. No, but the truth of the matter is, when parents don't apologize to children, they are communicating a terrible, terrible lesson. They're communicating you only have to apologize when the person whom you offended is stronger than you. But obviously, you should apologize whenever you've done something wrong to anybody, and particularly, a child. So it's very important for the dignity of the child to apologize. So that was an important lesson for me. But I learned a number of important lessons when it comes to apologizing. One of the important things to do when you apologize is to accept full responsibility for what you've done. I'll give you an example drawn from American history. A little over 100 years ago, the first Jew to be appointed to the Supreme Court, interesting that we're talking about this during the week following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The first Jew who ever served on the American Supreme Court was famously Louis Brandeis. Brandeis was nominated to the court by President Wilson. And in those days, justices were routinely approved without much controversy. By the way, that was true in the United States until not that long ago. As many of you have probably read, Ruth Ginsburg herself was confirmed by a vote of like 96-3. And Scalia was confirmed by, I think, a unanimous vote. Even though later on, both of them became controversial. Ruth Ginsburg among positions criticized by conservatives, and positions of Scalia, criticized by liberals. But Brandeis's nomination was one of the first controversial nominations to the court. One of the people who most opposed it was a former president of the United States, William Howard Taft. Now, much of the opposition to Brandeis really was anti-Semitic. 6 former presidents of the American Bar Association wrote a public letter on Brandeis, and it was clearly animated by anti-Semitism. Taft was not. Taft was not an anti-Semite, but he had a very strong opposition to Brandeis's judicial views. He considered him, for whatever the reason, I don't know why, he thought that he was a very devious person and would inflict great harm on the court. Brandeis won by a pretty small margin and served on the court. 2 years later, an event that never happened before and never has happened again was Taft, who was a former president of the United States, was nominated to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he does become Chief Justice. But actually, a few years later, even earlier than that, Brandeis used to take a walk every evening. And one time while walking, he actually encountered Taft. And Taft said to him, "Mr. Brandeis, a number of years ago, I did you a great injustice. Please accept my apology." And Brandeis did. And then when Taft was appointed to the court, they sat on the court together. They continued to have very different views judicially, but Taft's perception of Brandeis changed. It modeled, which is actually fitting because we're talking about Ginsburg and Scalia, where it's a well-known fact that despite their very different judicial views, they were able really to retain a friendship. In fact, the story just came out after Ginsburg's death that Scalia's son wrote an article in which he recounted an episode in which on Ruth Ginsburg's birthday, Scalia sent her 24 roses, and one of his law clerks said, "Why would you do that? Do you know how many 5-4 decisions didn't go your way because of Ruth Ginsburg?" And he says, "There are some things that are more important than winning a case." It was a whole different way of viewing it. So we have in the papers of Taft a letter he wrote to his daughter in which he said, "I have come to like Brandeis very much personally." So I want to say something. Apologies don't have to be very, very long. But this is the indispensable quality of an apology. The person who's apologizing has to assume full responsibility for the hurt they inflicted. I'll tell you what I mean. Imagine if I had said to my daughter, Naomi, "I really apologize. For me to snap at you was not right, but you have to admit that when you keep making the same error, it does get pretty irritating." The whole dignity that the apology conferred on her would have been removed. Could you imagine if Taft, when he apologized to Brandeis, said to him, "Mr. Brandeis, I said some very not nice things about you. It was wrong of me, but you do have to admit you took some pretty outrageous positions." Again, the whole power of the apology would be lost. Now, the irony is when you do assume the full responsibility, it then makes it easier for the other person in many instances to acknowledge that they're somewhat at fault. I'm certainly not perfect either. I helped create the problem, whatever. So that's really, again, when you apologize, it's important that you apologize. It's important that you accept full responsibility. And it's important that you make your apology at least somewhat specific. If I did anything this year that offended you, I'm sorry. The clear underpinning or the clear suggestion is, you're so sensitive. If I did something that caused you in your oversensitive way to overreact, I apologize. You got to assume full responsibility and thereby let the other person have their dignity restored. You really have to have the person's dignity restored. So again, we've covered actually quite a bit of territory. The 3 attitudes on forgiveness, when obligatory, when optional, and when forbidden, and on apologies. Seek out somebody if you hurt. Make the apology specific, assume full responsibility, and think right now, if you can think of anybody with whom you once had a good relationship that has grown cold over the years, or that you did something that you regret. Think about it and think maybe before Yom Kippur, I'll do it. The great thing about Yom Kippur, the brilliance of Yom Kippur is it gives us an excuse to make such a call. It gives the other person an excuse to be more willing to forgive. And with that thought in mind, let me wish you all a Shana Tova U'Metuka, as Mark said at the beginning, a good year and a sweet year. And I'll tell you what occurred to me, why we often say a sweet year. By the way, somehow I just went off. I don't know what happened to my...
You're on.
I am on? Okay, fine. My video disappeared. Okay. I want to say something about what a sweet year. Inevitably in life, we're all destined to make changes. We're all destined to have to learn lessons. And lessons are often painful. So when we say, may you have a good year and a sweet year, may it be a year in which you do have occasion to learn lessons, but may they be learned in a sweet way. Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rabbi, thank you very much. You have time for a couple of questions? Because I know it's
Certainly.
late there. Is that okay? So if anybody has any questions, feel free to enter them in the question and answer on the bottom of the screen. Rabbi, you just spoke about how, if my sister calls me and says, I just want to, apologize if I hurt you during the year, you said, not quite good enough. You have to have some specifics, full ownership, etc. With modern technology, how is it okay to actually ask for forgiveness? Can I do it over the phone? Can I do it via email? Can I do it on my Facebook page? Can I do it in text? Or does it have to be in person if I do take ownership and offer the specifics?
Those who argue that it has to be in person obviously would amend as long as you're standing 6 feet away. No, the truth of the matter, is all of them are possible.
Okay.
Oh, what's going on with my camera? Okay.
Oh.
The truth of the matter is all ways of communication are possible. In fact, one could argue that one of the great things about the telephone is it expanded the opportunity now to do mitzvot, to do kind deeds, which is interesting because there's no question that the telephone expanded the opportunity to do bad things. It used to be if some people said something bad about you, it would take a long time till other people, certainly in other towns, found out about it. Now they can find out about it immediately with the telephone, with the computer. So any way is appropriate. Now, by the way, you might be in a relationship. I always do with my sister and brother-in-law. And the truth is, I can't really think of anything, and they can't really think of anything. So it's just sort of a statement. But there are inevitably some people who we hurt. And then you should try and be specific. I'm not saying you have to rack your brain, with about 30 different people. What did I maybe do that was insensitive? But there might be instances where there is less warmth in a relationship than there used to be.
Okay, great. Somebody, knowing how hard it can be at times to forgive someone, are there specific Jewish texts that you can summarize or point to that provide tools or ideas to help shift from anger and hurt to forgiveness?
Okay. I have one text in mind, but it's extremely embarrassing for me to say it. I have a chapter on how to forgive in my Code of Jewish Ethics. And there, you know what, maybe I'll open it up for just a minute. It's not wise to start doing this in the middle of a speech. Yeah, so I there quote sources that people could then look up. So, for example, I quote, so at least if, as I said, it's embarrassing. I don't want to push people to go, in my book, A Code of Jewish Ethics. It is available on Amazon. Okay. But the point I want to make is I quote there from other people. I don't know one specific, long chapter anywhere, but among the people I quote to is Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who's a great scholar in Israel, clearly from Maimonides. I've wrote to Rabbi Natan, the fathers according to Rabbi Nathan. uh, I quote an incident which opens up another way of viewing it from the Torah. I give one way to achieve forgiveness is to reflect on some unintended good that resulted from the wrong done to you. As Joseph says to his brother, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the survival of many people. Sometimes, though, you can't think of anything good that happened. And there is an interesting thing. There's a challenge to pray for people. If people sincerely request forgiveness and you're not really ready, take into account and pray for the person who seeks you, who has sought your forgiveness. Pray that you can find it in your heart to forgive if you feel that the person really regrets it. And again, you're only saying that you have to do it if you think it was, if the suffering you endured was not irrevocable. If it really led to an irrevocable suffering, then don't. But again, as I emphasized, if you find that you're sort of consumed by it and it really bothers you, and that any time this person's name comes up, you start letting loose or doing something like that, then it's probably not that great a thing for you. And remember what I said about that Rabbi Eliyahu Lopian. Lopian said, okay, let me think about it. I'll work on myself. Give me a couple of weeks and then come back.
So, Rabbi,
Yes.
why on Yom Kippur do we ask for forgiveness of things that we ourselves nor possibly do because it doesn't exist any longer, what have you?
Sorry, repeat it. I didn't fully understand the question.
Why do we ask for forgiveness on Yom Kippur during the service when we, read a list of things that we want to say we're sorry about that we did not do? So why apologize for something I did not do?
Are you proud that Jews have won something like 20 or 25% of the Nobel Prizes?
Sure.
Okay. Then you should be ashamed when Jews do bad things. Otherwise we're in the odd situation. We're part of a people. Now it's an interesting thing. Slavery existed in the United States. Except for the German Jews who arrived very early in American history, virtually none of the Eastern European Jews were in any way responsible for that. And yet we're Americans. And just as we feel proud and pride in much of the good America does, we're proud that we're living in the country that did produce the Declaration of Independence. There is a sense of shame about what we didn't do. So it's a very good question. I once read somewhere, and I have no idea if it's true or if it's apocryphal, that Felix Frankfurter, who was a Jew who was on the Supreme Court, that he claimed that he stopped going to synagogues on Yom Kippur in part exactly because of that prayer. He said it offended him, the notion of confessing the things you didn't do. But we're confessing that we live in a world where those things are done, and maybe we haven't done enough to try and stop those things from being done.
Okay.
So,
Rabbi, sorry, go ahead.
No. So just, that's what I'm thinking about. Is it apparent that I have no really great answer to that question? That is true. What I did do, maybe I'll send it to you. Maybe you could send it out in the community. Only once in my life have I ever composed a prayer. I think it's the only time I ever composed a prayer. And I remember I submitted it to be published in the New York Jewish Week. And it unfortunately was published the week of 9/11. So it was about the only article in the newspaper that was not about the horrors of that week. And so it sort of just disappeared. But the prayer was called for the mitzvah I did. Because, in the traditional Siddur, if you do the whole Orthodox service, you end up repenting like 9 times. You recite Al Chet Shechatanu, for the sin we committed. And I wanted for people's self-esteem also to just do listings of good things that we've done, kind things that we've done. And because I think that's also important to remind people. You know, you do want to remind people of something good. I think it was brilliant when Spielberg decided to finally to do a movie about the Holocaust, that he focused on Oskar Schindler. And I'll tell you why I think it was so brilliant. Non-Jews are very aware of how angry the Jewish world is, that the Holocaust happened, that not a lot of people protested, but it introduced the horror of the Holocaust to non-Jews with a figure that they could be proud of. And that's what made it, I think, more accessible to them than it had just been a story just only told from the Jewish perspective about it. So I think it was the right story in a way to be told. And I think I don't want people to be walking out of shul only thinking of themselves just as sinners. And because what we want is, we want people not only to refrain from doing the bad things in the al-Khayt, we also want them to be positively doing good things. So I want to remind people of good things that they could do, you know? I remember once my wife and I were getting out of a taxi in New York. We had gone somewhere. It was very late at night. It was 1:30 in the morning. It was early on a Sunday morning. And as we're about to get out of the taxi, we suddenly see a woman's purse, or just maybe it was just a wallet, actually. And, you know, we thought for a second of giving it to the driver, and then I didn't know what the driver would necessarily do. So we took it up and we went to ran up to our apartment, and we started looking through it. And the woman's name was actually listed, but we tried to find any information, telephone. But then I saw, it was clearly a younger woman because we saw her driver's license. And then I saw a card with her, you know, the same last name as hers, a man's name. So we figured it was probably her parents. And I remember my wife said to me, "You can't call them at 1:30 in the morning." I said, "Listen, this woman, which she just lost every card she has, is probably going crazy." So I was willing to run the risk. So we called up. They were in Florida, and a woman answered the phone, not her mother, her stepmother, and she obviously called the girl, who then called us. So 10 minutes later, she clearly had been crying hysterically, and she came over to our house. Her blood, my wife and we felt like such heroes, and when you do something good, it really does make you feel so good that you have, the opportunity to do it. And I want to remind people, because I'm hardly the only person who had that experience. I've had a number of experiences in my life where I was able to return lost items to people, and they were all memorable. And so I do want to remind people of that, even though when we confess to sins, we're confessing to sins that were committed in our community and that maybe we didn't do enough to stop.
Rabbi, one last question for you. Is Yom Kippur a day of asking, is it about my personal relationship with God, my personal relationship with other human beings, or is it about my own relationship with myself in regards to asking for forgiveness?
That is a smart question, and the answer is it's about all. Primarily, if you really analyze the Jewish texts, primarily it's about our relationship to God. But you're making a very good point. If it's only about our relationship to God, why are so many of the al-Khayt, so many of the sins to which we confess, interpersonal sins? So the truth is, it's about our relationship to God. Ideally, before Yom Kippur, you really did try and reconcile with other people. Guess what? If you didn't do so before Yom Kippur, you can do so after Yom Kippur. And then it is about between human beings and themselves. All I know is that if I've had a meaningful Yom Kippur, where I did try and make sure my relationships were in pretty good shape, and you then reconcile in a sense with God, the effect of those two things is you're going to feel a lot better about yourself. I know that among the happiest moments in the year for me are the very end of Yom Kippur, when the shofar is blown, and I feel a certain cleansing of my soul.
Beautiful. Well, Rabbi, listen, thank you very much for your wise words and for joining us late your time this evening. And we're grateful for everybody who joined us. Just a reminder, we have 2 future scheduled Thoughtful Thursday programs coming up. On October 22nd, we have esteemed journalist and author Yossi Klein Halevi, who will be speaking to us from Jerusalem. And on November 19th, Rabbi Elka Abramson, the president of the Wexner Foundation, will be joining us. More information to come. I just hope everybody enjoys their evening, and I too want to extend my best wishes for a meaningful Yom Kippur holiday and fast and a Gamar Chatima Tova. Thank you very much, and thank you, Rabbi.
And thank all of you who've been on. Thank you, and I look forward one day to actually having a chance to speak to you all in a more personal way.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.